Okay, the recording is started.
Okay.
Somebody's given some feedback though. Okay.
All right. So I'm going to go ahead and call this work session to order on Assembly Continuing Education. If we can go ahead and do a roll call.
Yes. Miss Allard. Jamie is on. I know she sent the message and she's got her phone dialed in.
Here.
There we go. Okay. Mr. Constant. Mr. Dunbar.
Here.
Miss Kennedy.
Here.
Miss LaFrance. Mr. Perez-Verdia. Mr. Peterson.
Present.
Miss Quinn Davidson.
Here.
Mr. Rivera.
Present. And then also Miss Dalatel and Mr. Constant are excused.
Okay. And is Mr. Weddleton on?
Mr. Constant are excused.
Okay. So let me see. I'm missing a few people. Miss LaFrance. Mr. Perez-Verdia. And I don't see Mr. Weddleton either.
Okay. I think two of them are likely going to be joining us in the next few minutes. But we'll go ahead and get started. So this is our monthly Assembly Continuing Education. I think we have two topics today. First is a review of the Assembly Sexual Harassment PNP, and Deannis is going to be leading us on that. Then second is a presentation on the Assembly Document Prep Guidelines, and Deannis and Dean Gates are going to be leading us on that. So let's go ahead and start with the Assembly Sexual Harassment PNP. Go ahead, Dee.
Okay. Hey, well, good morning to all. On the line, I also have asked Blair Christensen, one of our Department of Law attorneys who does a lot of employment law and this type of law, to participate or to be available for questions, and also Heather McAlpine, who is the Director of Office of Equal Opportunity, OEO. I'll try to spell those out for Jamie, but she will also be available. Now, what I'd like to do is go right through the policy, because this very much is a CLE. If you ever get interviewed for something along these lines, the first question they will ask you, and I'm going to tell you the answers you don't give, are, do you have a policy? Well, I think so. Have you read it? Well, probably. Who do you report to? Well, probably my supervisor. That is the start of a very bad interview with a compliance agency. You need to say, yes, I have it, I've read it, and we get annual training, and I know exactly who I report to. So I would like to go through the first part of the policy. It's really a CLE. It should take 10, 15 minutes, and then open it up to questions, the more colorful questions about, well, what about this conduct? What about that conduct? And that's specifically why I have both Blair and Heather on the phone, is because they're two people who handle much of this. So going through the policy, this is the Assembly policy. The administration also has a policy, 40-38, slightly different. One, we wanted to respect sort of separation of powers issues, but also different rules. Your employees, so for instance, the clerk employees, their administration, they follow our personnel rules and our mayor's directives, our P&Ps. This is in addition to those. So there's a little of a crossover of reporting, and we'll go through that. So going right through your policy, the policies to prevent unlawful sex discrimination or sex-based harassment, those are defined later on, and I'll go through the definitions quickly, but I figure that's where Blair and Heather will be most helpful. The policy applies to the Assembly Department, and the Assembly, that's Assembly members, so that's your elected or appointed people, aides, volunteers, and interns. So you notice none of those are employees. And those people are collectively referred to as Assembly personnel. The employees of the Assembly Department follow our PMP 40-38. And again, we'll look at that a teeny bit. I'm skipping through the next few sections. I'm getting assistance from the clerk's office because I knew I could never do this. Then we go to definitions. pretty much the same. The member is one of you, elected or appointed. You know what aides are. Personnel is the collective group, volunteers. Compliance agencies, this is an important concept. Compliance agencies are generally outside of the MOA or functioning outside of the MOA. So that's your State Commission for Human Rights. AERC, which even though we house them downstairs, they are a compliance agency, and that is a formal deal. It's not a informal, I just need some advice deal. That is OEO. OEO is our internal, more informal attempt to resolve these type of complaints. A complaint is something filed with a compliance agency. Office of Equal Opportunity. Again, this is an office through Heather that provides information and assistance to employees who believe they have been discriminated against. One of the mandates is that OEO try to resolve these within 30 days. So that really is the informal resolution process. Retaliation. You can read that: materially adverse action taken against an employee who is opposing unlawful sex discrimination, sex-based harassment, or because the employee has made a charge, testified. Pretty much what you would think, but again, that will probably be drawn out more in questions. Sex-based or sex discrimination, unequal treatment of employees with respect to terms and conditions of employment, and that includes sex, gender, sexual orientation, or gender identity. Sex-based harassment, unwelcome visual, verbal, or physical conduct of sexual nature, including sexual advances, requests for sexual favors, touching of a sexual nature, or other conduct of a sexual nature, as well as hostile behaviors. Sex-based harassment is prohibited when it is sufficiently severe or pervasive that it creates a hostile or offensive work environment, or when it results in adverse employment decisions such as discipline, demotion, or termination. And Blair and Heather have been in countless numbers of this. Sometimes it's a simple misunderstanding, other times it's not. Reporting, very important for everybody to know.
Actually, really quickly, Dee, before
Sure.
you go into reporting, just want to note for the record, we've been joined by Ms. LaFrance and Mr. Weddleton. Thanks.
Okay, reporting, so this is something you should know. The employees, those that mostly work in Barbara's shop, report that they have to follow our municipal policy 40-38. And Blair, did you have a chance, a quick review? Is it fairly complex? You'll see later on in your own reporting that if it's this person, you do this, if it's that person, you do that. But Blair, who is it generally to in the administration?
Generally, all the employees, I think we anticipate that all the employees, aides and interns would go through, would report through HR. And then if the misconduct is alleged against an assembly member, it would go through the municipal attorney's office.
Okay. And the reason for that, if it's a member and you're an elected official, when you go to the municipal attorney, initially it is confidential. It protects the city in terms of, I think, potential liability. So there are a number of reasons it will go through the municipal attorney. The municipal attorney in that role is not necessarily an advocate for the city. It's someone who, I think later on you'll see in this, that we say, hey, they make the initial determination whether it's informal enough and it can go to OEO or it needs to be a full investigation. So we'll be doing that in a second. But your regular line employees will generally go to OEO or Human Relations, I believe. Okay.
Before you continue, I have a question from Ms. Quinn Davids.
Okay.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. Dee, it occurs to me that I probably should have invited my aide to attend this presentation. And then I'm just thinking about what since I didn't do that, what I should do instead. Are you planning to distribute this? I know we've seen it, I mean, Forrest and I worked on it, but are you planning to distribute it? Could we send it to anyone who works for us? And what would you advise us to do? Should we suggest they do a training? Should we just ask them to read it and speak with you if they have questions?
Certainly we should distribute it. In fact, we should be doing that anyway. And then maybe say if they do have questions, I'd be more than glad to meet with them.
Okay,
how many
great.
do you have right now in terms of the whole group?
Sorry?
How many aides do this? How many people do you have right now?
I don't know. I think that more than half of us have an aide.
Okay, well then I'd be glad to meet with them, but I think definitely distribute that. In fact, that's probably a responsibility of the city to do that.
I'm wondering if it might be more efficient to have Desiree or someone who knows all the aides to distribute the document to all of them and then sort of communicate together versus all of us each saying, oh, if you want a training, talk to me, and then I'll. Is that something the clerk's office could do and maybe just CC us or something?
This is Desiree. I can send out this policy as well as Dee's ethics training that I believe I sent out last year also to all of the aides. That's not a problem.
Great. Thanks so much.
And by the way, as an employee, and that's not the aides, but as the employee, they are able to get administrative leave to go talk to OEO. I personally, I think, and I hope Blair will correct me, I think we do that a little bit more informally. I mean, most employees can walk down to OEO without, I think, problems with their supervisors. But I suppose if they're coming over from AWU and they really are taking off real time, then that's when that this might happen, so they can request administrative leave. And Blair, I guess the one question there is, if they, let's say they have a concern with their immediate supervisor, how do they request administrative leave? So it's their supervisor that does their time management.
They can request leave through the human resources. They can send an email to typically labor relations and request the leave, and then we would work with the time admin with and their supervisor to put the appropriate amount of administrative leave into their time card.
So they don't have to request permission from their supervisor, or do they?
Well, I mean, any employee has to request. They can't just get up and leave the workplace and not request, leave from their supervisor. They don't necessarily need to tell. So they would obviously need to request leave from their supervisor if they're going to leave the workplace at other times, other than their breaks or lunch. But they don't necessarily have to tell their supervisor why they're requesting leave. And then they can later on request administrative leave for reporting this through HR.
Okay. So, and then each assembly division manager, and I think that's Barbara and Dean, I'm not sure who else are your managers, need to make sure that your employees are familiar with the administrative municipal policy 40-38. And that was attached to this when this went through an ordinance, so we can easily find it for you. But it's also in the muni.org, the P&Ps. It's in there. Okay, the chair of the assembly may request assistance from the municipal attorney's office, OEO, or employee relations if an allegation of discrimination or harassment under this policy involves assembly department employees or assembly personnel, excluding assembly members. So you have your choice of where to go, but you have to do something. You can't ignore it. That's the biggest way that the municipality gets in trouble, is that we sit on these things too long. If it is an assembly member, you request assistance from the municipal attorney. And then allegations against assembly members, the matter shall be referred to the municipal attorney for recommendation for referral. If the referral, if it appears to be a less serious allegation, the municipal attorney can refer to OEO for an informal resolution within 30 days. And more serious ones, the municipality assists the chair in actually hiring an independent investigator who has to be an attorney in Alaska. With respect to both the municipal attorney and the investigator, the chair will be deemed to be the client for purposes of attorney-client communications and privilege. The investigator reports jointly to the attorney and the chair, to the municipal attorney and the chair. The investigator prepares a summary report without naming or identifying the victim or witnesses. If the summary report concludes that the conduct of the assembly member is in violation of the policy, the report shall be subject to public disclosure upon concurrence of the municipal attorney. If it concludes that the allegations are unsubstantiated, the matter shall be deemed dismissed. And of course, lots of issues about that. When did the public have a right to know? People are still trying to protect both the victim and the person who the accusations are made. And again, compliance agencies, employees of the assembly department and assembly personnel always have the right to actually file a complaint with the compliance agency. So bypass our internal processes completely, our OEO, our HR or attorney, the law office, the Department of Law. Let's see, and they just contact the appliance agency. So what's interesting about this, it appears that an assembly member does not have the right to file with the compliance agency, and I'm pretty sure that would be wrong, but the assembly member would do so as well. But I think this whole procedure is to help protect both the assembly member, the victim, and the city by having a more thorough investigation. So that is it with respect to the CLE portion of this. And if people have questions, please feel free.
And Dee keeps saying CLE, which is what we lawyers call continuing legal education. But Dee, not everyone's a lawyer, and this isn't actually a CLE, right?
Yeah, except you guys named it that.
Did we? No, it's continuing education.
Yeah, but Felix named it that.
No legal. Although
Yeah, there is no legal part to this. But if anyone has any questions, feel free to put yourself in the queue or text me.
And I wondered if people would have questions about, well, what do you really mean? I figured there'd be a lot of what ifs, but Chris is absent today, so we don't have as many of those what ifs.
And, aside from that, I feel like we've likely seen this a lot. So I think we've gone through a lot of what ifs, but maybe Mr. Dunbar has some.
Dee, I just wanted you to reiterate and make sure I'm on the same page. So for traditional Assembly Department employees, so people who are working, the Assembly Attorney, for example, or, people who are working in the clerk's office, does this apply? Or does a separate muni policy apply, or do both apply?
And Blair, I don't know if you want to answer that.
Okay. I think that's a complicated question because let's say, for instance, that an assembly member harassed a member of the clerk's office. Well, they would both apply because the employee of the clerk's office is covered under the municipal 40-38 and has a duty to report that to OEO and HR, but the investigation would occur because it's an assembly member. The investigation would occur under this policy. So I think in the vast majority of situations, they will both apply, and it depends on who the complainant is and who the subject of the complaint is and how that would unravel.
Can I ask a follow-up to that?
Yes.
Yeah, go ahead.
So if you've got these dual sets of reporting guidance, and I think it makes sense, the employee would go to OEO or to HR, and then certainly those entities would loop in the chair of the assembly. Let's assume it's not the chair of the assembly, correct? But the underlying substance, that is what constitutes sexual harassment or what constitutes unacceptable behavior, is there a difference between what we have here and the other policy of the municipality?
No, both. The behavior is the same under both. It is the policies are distinguished between who is reporting and who is the potential person to have committed the sexual harassment. And so it's not the behavior that determines, it's either the employees or the aides or an assembly member that determines how we handle it.
And can I interject for us, because I think that's a good question. If an assembly employee reports to HR, does HR report, and assuming it's not the chair that's involved, does HR then report to the chair necessarily? I don't think we addressed that in the policy, but how would that generally work?
I think how that generally works is that when we open the when HR, if it's, let's say it's a clerk employee, both the reporter and the potential person who committed the behavior they're both clerk employees, then Barbara would be notified by HR, and Barbara would be the person who would then go to the chair and report that this is going on.
Okay. And because one of the things, even though there's a certain amount of confidentiality in some of this stuff, we also want people up the chain to know what's going on, so there's no inadvertent retaliation. That all of a sudden the purported victim is moved into a different position. Well, that's an instant retaliation or potential retaliation claim against the city when the movement may be totally unrelated to the complaint. So we try to let people know, wait a minute, there is this other action going on. Please consult HR for any movement of the employee or discipline on another front.
So Dee, you said at the beginning of the presentation that we should be able to answer whether or not we have a policy and who our supervisor is, and I think also who we're supposed to report to. So could you say for assembly members, who is their supervisor? And if they feel they have been sexually harassed, who do they report to?
I think they have to go to the chair. And Blair, correct me if I'm wrong, but it's straight to the chair.
Yes, unless, and this is always the rub, is that if it is the chair that has committed the actions, then there would have to be an alternative process.
Well, and that's actually in the policy that says, or in the case where the conduct of the chair is at issue. So then they go to the vice chair.
Thank you.
And most of it's that you have affirmatively read this and you know it exists and you've read it.
Thank you. I'll just take a quick pause for any other questions. Okay, I'm not seeing any. Thank you so much, Dee.
Okay.
We'll go ahead and move on to the second portion, which is the assembly document prep guidelines presentation by Dee and Dean. Go ahead.
Let me put this on my bigger monitor that I can read. And thank you, Blair and Heather. Okay. And I'm going to start off, but Dean's going to regularly interject. So let me get this on my screen. Okay. And from the various basics, just the types of documents, AO, Assembly Ordinance, AR, Assembly Resolution, AM, Assembly Memorandum, and AIM, the Assembly Information Memorandum, and we'll go through those a little bit. I think we'll go through this later on, so let me go ahead and move. Oh, here, substitute documents. So the substitute for an AO has an S, for the ARS, and then here's the one that is a little bit confusing, and I don't know if Barbara was going to join us, although if she did, she probably would have joined it later than this. But the AMA, Substitute Assembly Memorandum, that we'll get into more because there's two types. One is you're changing the your AM, and two is when you're complying with a code provision that says if you do an S version, you need to summarize what the changes are. And that's where I like bullet points, because I say, okay, here are the 5 things that have changed from the S version, so that people can quickly surmise what those are. Okay, so going back to these, more information on these different types of documents is, when do I need an ordinance? It's any one of these things. These are in the, these are actually in the.
Dee,
yeah, go ahead.
I think Dean has something he'd like to add.
Okay.
Oh, yes, I wanted to add the AN that's attached to an S substitute version. It's also the place where you explain why the change is being made, not only what it is. Maybe something came up or something was discovered. You could explain why you're making a change in that particular part of the substitute. I also just wanted to add that the types of documents, the 4 types we're talking about, we refer to them as legislative documents. So you might hear that from time to time, and that's what we mean. And those are the only real 4 forms that we see and that are on each agenda for assembly action. So Okay, go ahead, Dean.
And I was going to say too, as these are legislative documents, in the state system, they have a drafting manual, and you must by state statute comply. And I think we have a code section that indicates you should try to follow format, but I think we are looser. It is not an absolute law. And I think, Dean's been doing this for 15 years. I've been doing it for 12 years. And questions will come up, and I think we try to answer them more in common sense now than here's some rule that's been somewhere in the ether, and that we want to be more common sense. And you'll hear me later on say one of my biggest things about legislative drafting is it still needs to be in English. It needs to be a subject, verb, and object. And hopefully a sentence is less than 3 lines long. But the minute you see that, these 5-line sentences, think English, write to English, think of who your audience is, that these are not supposed to be these esoteric drafting. So at any rate, I'll get back to that again. In the administration side, I and Quincy Arms largely review.
If I could add something there, Dean, before
Sure.
you go back.
But
And like you said, these are guidelines, and the general intent is whatever you're drafting is that what you're trying to do is clear. So maybe we won't follow guidelines exactly as long as what is being indicated, changed in code or so forth, it's clearly stated it clearly. Sometimes you'll see some parenthetical notes that say, for example, we're adding a new section to this ordinance that wasn't in the original ordinance and so forth. Explanatory phrases like that, just make sure that the intent is clear, even though maybe what we're doing isn't exactly addressed in the guidelines or slight deviation from the guidelines. So that's the overarching concept, to be very clear about what the intent is of the change or what you're drafting. Okay.
Okay, and I was going to add, you get these huge books on your Fridays before an assembly meeting. Well, all of those documents have had to be reviewed by myself or Quincy or Dean. There's a huge volume of documents, and on the administration side, where we check every single code site. We cite a code, we check it. We make sure it's internally consistent. We talk to the department, so there's a lot of work in those, that review. So as awful as your big notebooks are, that's how much work we're going through on the front end of that. And then, as you know, as with the recent appropriation ordinance, some of these have gone through year-long processes where Dean and the Department of Law are working with people. Some of them are much quicker. And to be a little bit patient about deadlines. By the way, the Rules Committee meetings on Friday mornings, which are paced deadlines, are problematic. I'll just mention that as I'm going on. Okay, ordinances. Let's go back to the documents. The list of ordinances you see.
So, D, could we mention PACE and the difference between the administration and the PACE process, the Assembly's process for submitting documents?
Okay, so it is what? Why don't you explain this? Assembly, and I'll explain the PACE.
Sure.
Okay, well, the PACE process is simply.
And so as.
Go ahead, Dean.
So as Dee was saying, the Friday noon deadline that we have for documents, that's a deadline for the documents to be in the clerk's agenda team in their hands, and so they can start preparing them for the packet. They need to number the pages, put them together, put on the dates, meeting dates, and a number of other things. The agenda item number, where it is on the agenda, all those things they need to do to make it ready. So the noon deadline, though, and how we get there is different for the administration and the documents that they submit. They use a system called PACE, and it goes through some workflows and routings through different departments. And we didn't make that part of this training. We have a similar PowerPoint for PACE training for the administration side, but the Assembly has different process. We in the Assembly side, when I draft this legislative documents for them, we often work with departments and talk to them about this change or that change and so forth. But the final product, when we're getting it ready, it goes from Assembly members and me, maybe the departments we worked with, sort of informally. And at the end, as you've all seen, we email it directly to the agenda team at the clerk's office. So the PACE system is different because departments really need to get their documents into the PACE system maybe Thursday or Wednesday, so that it is tracks where they go, so the executive department heads can check off and make sure they've seen it, they know what's going on, so the administration is on the same page. And at the end, the municipal manager and mayor, they finally check off before it's sent to the agenda. And so that's a little bit different. And I just wanted to explain why you hear about PACE and what it is. The Assembly doesn't really use that system very often, but it is important to understand what happens on that side of the aisle. Does that explain it well enough?
Yeah, and that PACE system, by the way, which is just our internal tracking system, is being is going to change into what's called on-base this summer. And so they're actually going to sort of combine the systems where should be more intuitive ways to put these documents into PACE, and then the workflow, and then they actually jump over to Barbara's group. Because right now our PACE system, it stops at giving it to, I think, Heidi, other people in the clerk's office, and then they re-enter lots of stuff. So very time-consuming system for both sides, and that's again being redone. I think that's supposed to be open in July. It's already, training is starting right now with a few the people who most deal with this in each department. And by the way, the PACE system, what that really is, let's say an ordinance, it gets put into PACE, and then the department person head signs off on it, then it immediately goes to legal. Because if we can see there's major problems, we reject things, and we reject things quite a bit. That doesn't make sense, or that's inconsistent with this one. Other than that, we're redrafting half of those. The people who write these documents are not attorneys, nor are they part of a regular legislative staff office like at the state. So you have your, head of, let's say, SWS, and they're trying to write, or the people right below them are trying to write these documents. They really don't know how to do it. And so even though people say, well, geez, you should be teaching them, we have too much turnover, and the average person is not a great writer. And so really the Department of Law and Dean's shop as well, because we exchange things back and forth on a regular basis. We get help from each other, especially when we have deadlines. Our generally attorneys are better writers, you hope. But to be a little bit patient on some of these documents, because there's a tremendous amount of rewriting that has to be done. Okay, so going back to the ordinances.
Actually, before you go on, I have a question from Ms. Kennedy.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Dee or Dean, I don't care who answers this, but I've definitely heard in the past that something is in the PACE system. So I understand that it's in the system, but is there any way to access that and find out exactly what's in the hopper and kind of where it is on the progression chain?
It is if you're part of the PACE system, which we have logins and access and that kind of thing, but I think that's only on the administration side. Because until it's gone a lot further through the process, and I mean, the municipal manager rejects these on a regular basis as well. They probably don't want it out for public looking at it. And it's sort of the same thing on the administration side. A lot of times I won't hear about an administration item that's going to be on the addendum until Friday morning. Sometimes not, but a lot of times that's true. And Ms. Kennedy, with the new system, I would imagine there's still going to be some type of restriction that the Assembly wants their documents that goes far without administration input, and vice versa.
Okay, well, thank you. That helps me understand a little bit more about.
Yeah, and I would add the PACE system. Like Dee said, the public doesn't have access to that. That's for the administration to prepare, and when the document's final, then release it to the agenda team where it will become public. And before it's public, you don't want your drafts and all of that before final approval, those things to be public often. And also on the other side here with the Assembly, we don't have access to the PACE system. I don't have access to the PACE system anymore. 3 years ago when I started as Assembly Council, I stopped having access to it. So if I wanted to know what's in there and what would be coming up, I would have to ask somebody, and I guess on the admin side, they could tell me or not. But you know, often, like you said, you might have heard of something that's being worked on and so forth. So, Krista, I think your question, how can you see what's really in the pay system? That's really at the discretion of people on the admin side to share with you. But I think that most of the time it's very amicable and I will tell you what's up. But you would really see what the admin is proposing when it's on the agenda. And like we see, it's a huge list of things. So I hope that answers your question.
Yes, yes, thank you.
I was going to just mention too that one of the things that the municipal manager is currently doing, which aligns with some of your own efforts, is that one of his questions when it gets all the way up to him, and by the way, I didn't finish, it goes from legal to finance to OMB, and then up to the municipal manager, and everybody there gets a pot shot at these things. But once it gets to municipal manager, one of the things that Mr. Falsey is now asking on a regular basis is what has been the public input on this? Just like that aim that Felix and yourselves put together, what, you know, has this been to community councils, has it not? And more and more of things that have made it through the PACE system, so they're technically well-written or correct, are getting stopped by the municipal manager and say, no, this has to go back. I want the stakeholders involved. So I think there's been a real effort for that. And we in legal, I asked that right off the bat. You know, the pawnbroker one was a perfect example. Has this been out to the pawn shops? What's been the input so far? So I think you, Felix, the assembly and the administration are aligned on that they want to make sure there's been public input on these documents. And of course, the thing that works against that is these late deadlines. So that happens still, but. Okay, so back to ordinance. Dean and I, Department of Law, this is in the charter. We look at this 10 times, 15 times a year. We just go back to these are the ones that have to be done by ordinance. Amending code is probably your most common one. So then if we can go to the next one, the resolutions. It's again a list.
Oh, Dee, could I add one thing there?
Sure.
So sometimes there's a piece of an ordinance or something that amends code. And like you said, we review to make sure that the reviews or the public participation that's required or that should take place is occurred. There's some that will amend things such as anything in the personnel rules. We have code sections that say any changes are required to be reviewed by the personnel rules committee or the employee relations board. And so we make sure that the documents, the AM, or maybe a resolution from those boards are included. And if they're not, we go, well, like you said, we reject it, send it to the board that's supposed to review first. And so a lot of that comes from our years of institutional knowledge and reviewing code and understanding which subject matters really need or are required to have some sort of board or commission review before the assembly. And that's an important screening function that we do.
And of course, that's very frustrating for you who have written and waited for an ordinance for or resolution for 6 months, and all of a sudden now it's got to go back through boards, which take time to assemble. So if we know about one of these things ahead of time, we'll try to tell people up front. Anything, by the way, that affects personnel rules definitely has its own board that had 2 boards that has to go through. So keep that in mind. So these other resolutions, these are all in the code: appropriations, marijuana, alcohol permits, naming of public places. And, you know, I don't have these memorized. When it comes up, a PACE item comes up, hopefully I have someone I can delegate who knows the answer right off the bat. But if not, just look it up in code. And you'll, of course, be relying on Dean and myself for that. When do you need a memorandum? An AM. For any ordinance, there has to be an AM. And I tell people that the AM is the sponsor's statement of intent. I tell my departments who are writing things, tell the story, explain it in English. The purpose of this ordinance is to blank. This is what we're trying to do. It does not have to be, again, esoteric and on and on. Make it readable. And I see the size of your books. You don't really have time to read 10 pages of AMs explaining what they're doing. Sometimes that's necessary, and maybe that's with attachments or some of the larger things that you probably have a work session on. But mostly an AM should tell the story in English and say what you're trying to do. And then again, this AM that's used to summarize changes in a substitute or S version. And again, those can be very brief. They should not be, in my opinion, they should not be 10 pages long. They should be 1 page long. An AM also can be a standalone document, and that is mostly in the purchasing world that you'll see that. And information about collective bargaining. An AM, by the way, and Dean, you might help me here, an AM is an action item, and that sort of helped me in the past. It requires assembly approval versus the next document, the AIM. It's just providing you information. So it is an action item. It does meet approval mandates, that if a document has to be approved, an AM is an action item. Dean, do you have anything to add to that?
Yes, please. Thanks, Dee. So one thing at the top here in the first bullet, this AM is a sponsor statement in support of an ordinance. And I wanted to just highlight a distinction here between the AM from the sponsor and the whereas paragraphs and clauses that we see in an ordinance and often in resolution. The sponsor statement, that's really more personal to the sponsor. Why are they submitting it and so forth? And so that's not, when it's attached to an ordinance, the AM is not really the legislation the body's adopting, that's the ordinance. The AM then isn't something that you would want to think of amending, that's the statement from the sponsor. So if other members want to make a separate statement, I don't really think anything really prevents someone from submitting another AM if you wanted to. You don't see that very often at all because you make your statements about what you think of it verbally on the record during the meeting. So the whereas clauses, in contrast, they are part of the legislation, part of the ordinance, and the body votes, right? You pass an ordinance by majority, or in some cases, supermajority. And you're also saying that the body as a whole, by majority vote, is adopting the whereas statements. So that's not what you're doing, sponsor statement. That's why the whereas statements, you don't want them to be maybe opinions, statements of opinion, or controversial statements, or maybe facts that people, some people think it's true fact, some people think that's false, so forth. You want whereas statements to be factual, plain, direct, and something that the body would generally agree on. So that's why sometimes you see time and you don't amend the AM, or you wouldn't want to put this in a whereas, and things like that.
And Dean, is it correct?
Oh, and I have also, I'm sorry, I had one other thing to add here.
Okay.
So you'll see these bullet lists here for the AM and also for the AOs and what they're used for, when do you need them, and you'll see that with the AIM as well in a minute. And I would just mention that we're going to talk about assembly document guidelines. The guidelines we have like a full page of bullets and to what they're used for, whether they're mentioned in code to use this or that. And so this is just a representative sampling of what you see most often.
And Dean, doesn't it say that the resolutions don't have to have an AM in code? But sometimes you do see...
They don't require an AM. Yes.
But sometimes you do see AMs with the resolutions.
Yeah, that's right. And I think for the same reason, so code does not require it. The code requires an AM for every ordinance. It doesn't require one for a resolution. So resolutions have a lot of different purposes that are used for different functions. I think the AOs are a little, the list of what they're required for is a little narrower. So resolutions, sometimes you want to make your own personal statements of support to why resolutions being put out there, or other background that you didn't want in the resolution itself. So you can add an AM to a resolution. You see that from time to time. I think that historically, I've seen that resolutions are favored if you can do some action by resolution. That's what most assembly members or the admin would choose. An ordinance, as you all know and see, requires to be introduced in at least 7 days of public notice of the public hearing at the next or future meeting and so forth. So that process is more deliberative and contemplative as an ordinance goes through resolution. It's a little faster and more efficient, I guess I would say, but it doesn't have as much process required. Although for some resolutions, as you'll see, the code does require them to have a public hearing. We talked about some of those, for example, appropriations over 100,000, but now it's 500,000 do require a public hearing. Anyways, I just thought I would mention that when you're considering which type of document you need.
Okay, and then the next one, the AIM. An AIM is when you want to provide information to the assembly about an item that would interest you or the public. And AIMs are often reports that are required in code already, and you accept them. They're often debated, but they are not an action item. They don't really require approval, although I guess you do vote on accepting them. Dean, I don't know if you have anything more to add on that. I know that's always a confusion whenever AIM documents are submitted, what does the assembly do with them?
I don't really have anything to add about those. I agree. And you see in the bullet list, there's some code provisions. There are some places in code where they said to submit this by an AIM, so they do that. And you mostly see these in section 9E, which I think is going to become 10E, 10E, and our May 19th agenda.
Okay. So this is a good deal. I can ask Dean all the hard questions. Okay, the next document, the C, the summary of economic effects. It's required of all proposed ordinances. The biggest exception for these is if there's no private sector economic effect and local government effects are less than 30,000, then you say that in your AM and say we anticipate the economic effects are less than 30,000 and therefore no C is attached. I've been after the administration for a while now. I think that these documents have to be explained. What are we really looking for, and what are they really telling us? So some of them are obvious increases, but they're really, I think, difficult for the average person to know what they're looking at, or what would be helpful to be included in these things. So I'm hoping that at some point we get a group together, maybe when we move into this on-base system, that these can be a little bit better defined. And I'm sure, I think of Ms. Kennedy, I'm sure they drive you crazy in particular, but anyway, they are required documents. One of the things the Department of Law checks for instance, it'll say their format is what are the revenue impacts and expense impacts for, say, the next 5 years. We make sure we have the years in there. They're using templates from 3 years ago, so it's telling you what's going to change, the last 5 years. So there's simple things like that, but I think these are one of the C documents that will probably be enhanced at some point, but they are required.
Thanks. Before we go on, I have a couple of folks in the queue. Ms. Quinn Davidson.
Yeah, thanks, Mr. Chair. Dee, maybe if I could scroll back, which I keep wanting to do, but can't, to the last slide, I could answer my own question. But I'm just thinking about AIMs. I mean, those are only from the administration, right? I mean, an assembly member would never write one. Well,
I think it came up the issue that Ms. Zalatel wanted to put in an AIM all her questions regarding a piece of, an ordinance or something that was going through that she had considerable concerns about. I think at that point, I think it was myself that discouraged that I said, can you imagine if every assembly person puts in an aim about their concerns? So I think she finally dropped that. So maybe you're right. Maybe that's the only time I've really seen that. Dean, I can't think of other aims.
Just in terms of sort of making it simple. And
yes, there were a few from time to time. In some items before the assembly, and they had either a report like from Agnew-Beck or McDowell or something that was really relevant to the subject matter, but it wasn't referenced or included in the whereas or the AM. And some member identified it and said, we want this to be part of the record for this item. They would do an LIM and CD attached. And sometimes, as you've seen with liquor licenses and so forth, there's sometimes a number of statements from council or others, and we attach it to the AIM to become part of the record for that resolution for protesting a liquor license and things like that. So you do see those by AIM from time to time, not very often, like Dee said. And the most common use for the AIMs are the regular reports required from departments or the administration, like the internal audit reports. They have their list of audits they need to do. When they're complete, they submit them by AIMs, and that's where you see it most often used. But the assembly does use an AIM from time to time.
Okay.
I wanted to add one thing, if I could, unless there was another question.
I wanted to ask a follow-up question about that, or maybe it's a comment.
Go ahead, Austin.
Sure, go ahead.
Okay, thanks. I was just waiting to make sure Dean could hear me. So I'm just thinking about Miss Allard and how overwhelming this might be, because it's confusing for us too, and we know all the acronyms and everything. So just to sort of simplify, if you want to change an ordinance, you draft an AO and you can get help, and then you write a memo about why. And then if you're doing a resolution, and there are a number of reasons you do that, you don't need to do a memo. I mean, that's kind of like the simple version of all of this, I think, but correct me if I'm wrong. And then I had a question about C's, which is the next slide.
Yes.
A statement of economic effects. And you were starting to say that it's required for every ordinance, but I don't think, we certainly don't see it for every ordinance. So can you clarify that?
Yeah, Austin, most of the time then it's in the actual AM, which has a two-liner right before the administration recommends approval, which says we don't think it's going to be more than 30,000, and therefore no C is attached.
Got it.
And that's most of your code
Could you
changes.
go down to the C slide? You see in the middle, in quote marks under number 1. Yep.
Got it. Thanks, you guys.
Could I add here?
Sure.
Sure, and then I have another person of
sometimes, yeah. So sometimes you have an ordinance that makes some code change, and of course we all start thinking hypothetically, so what will impact will this have on people and so forth, and maybe they'll incur some costs and all that. But sometimes you need to look more carefully at, so you pass it and make a code change. Does a code change itself have any effect? It might affect people who decide to engage in this business, or maybe be regulated, or engage in a line of business regulated by this code section that's changing, and maybe it doesn't affect the people currently in it. I'm trying to think of a good example off the top of my head. I'm not doing a very good job, but sometimes you have a code change and that itself doesn't affect anybody's costs and so forth. But it's the eventual effect. For example, a lot of Title 21 changes in land use code because of the nature of land use and private property rights and development rights. Often a change to Title 21 doesn't affect anything currently in place. It only prospectively affects new applications and so forth. So it doesn't have often a C because it doesn't have an economic effect until somebody files an application and new rules apply to them. So I also would add that sometimes you think you're making a change and you don't foresee an economic effect that would take place. So for example, we had some years ago a change to Title 23, the local amendments to the electrical code, the NEC code for requiring different kind of outlet, ground fault interrupted outlets. But that would have increased costs by, I think, 4 times the general cost of the standard outlets required by the code at that time. So we would say, yes, this would increase cost for new construction by this much and so forth. Anyways, it's sometimes not as easy to see there's an economic effect, and also sometimes it's not as easy to understand that there's no economic effect until somebody has an application in the future. So this isn't as straightforward as it seems.
Can I provide an example, Dean? Good example is, for instance, the responsible contracting ordinance you recently passed, which said to be part of the MOA competitive procurement process, you have to provide some information on your past safety record and wage record. So that doesn't have any immediate economic effect, even though it affects the procurement process in the long run. And we have a lot of that. The community work agreements, a lot of code provisions really have no immediate impact financially.
And to add one more thing here, and sometimes you see that, yes, this will have an effect, but you don't have any basis for sort of quantifying what the economic effect or the costs to the private sector or even the government are going to be, because you don't have some prior data to understand how to quantify numerically, those costs. And sometimes we will insert statements in the AM to that effect. Because there's no way to predict what these costs are going to be. The C is not included.
Thanks. Ms. Kennedy?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Yes, I do have some questions about the C as well. And just like Ms. Ennis mentioned, as soon as she started talking about this one, I thought, oh yes, this is something I really would like some more information on. And I guess I just want to say that first of all, Dean did a pretty good job of defining some of the issues and how a C isn't always as effective as you'd like it to be. And it doesn't a lot of times give you information that you can even really track. I mean, one of the things that we don't, as assembly members, have access to is a lot of the different funding sources that are listed by number in those Cs. So that kind of becomes problematic in terms of really trying to figure out where money came from, where it's going, how much money is left maybe in an account. Anyway, there are a lot of questions that I have about how we can try to make those a little more usable. It just seems to me that there's a lot of inconsistency in what we get in them anyway. One C may not necessarily look like another. So even the formatting I've seen has been kind of different depending on, I don't know if it's depending on the department that does it, or if there's just a reason for different forms. But anyway, I would love to be part of a bigger conversation on how to make these more usable for us, that make more sense and actually give us the kind of information that maybe we're looking for as assembly members. So if there's the potential for working on that and somebody wants to join me, and Mr. Chair, you want to help us figure out kind of what kind of mechanism to use to do that, sign me up. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Kennedy. Yeah, I guess for me, we can have this conversation offline, but I just want to know what exactly information that you're looking for. And then I guess Barbara isn't on here, but if she were, she would say that, I forget exactly the name of the position, but the Assembly used to have a position that was actually filled by now Senator L.V. Gray Jackson. And it was that position's job to verify all of the fund sources and do a lot of that kind of detailed work that you are asking for on the assembly side. Because of course, trust but verify, right? But yeah, I'd be happy to have an offline conversation with you, Ms. Kennedy.
Thank you.
So should we move forward?
Yeah, I don't see anyone else in the queue. Go ahead.
Okay, next one is process, and I think this is a little bit too simplistic. All of you.
If I could, Dee, I'm sorry, I have one thing to add before we move on.
Okay.
Sorry. So, Barbara, she's sent me an email. She's listening to our work session, and she wanted me to remind everyone when we were talking about the differences with an ordinance, or with a resolution and an AM and what they're used for. And one thing that the Assembly often sees are the liquor license protests. So when our business licensing clerk, Mandy Honest, is gathering the information, and she sees that, well, they've licensees complied with everything, there's no grounds really to protest. We've heard no statements from community council, assembly members about problems they've caused, and so nobody's asking for protest. And that's where we will often see, well, when it comes before you, there's no reason to protest. You see them by an AM. So that's basically where we say somewhere on AM that for these liquor licenses, the Assembly's waiving its right to protest the renewal or the new license or the transfer, as opposed to, this is where we often see the more controversial ones, and maybe there's a protest or maybe possible grounds. They will be submitted by a resolution. So Barbara wanted me to make sure to make that distinction, although they're both for liquor licenses. And that's the reason we have a different document in the different circumstances. Okay, I'm sorry. Should we go on to the public process?
Well, I was going to say that all of you that participated last Tuesday night are now an expert on this slide. And a public hearing is required for all ordinances. It has to be at least 7 days, and the way that's counted, that ends up being that it's not going to be the next, and actually like a week later, it's going to be the 2 weeks later type thing. Some resolutions, some don't, and that's what the whole modification was about Tuesday night, is certain resolutions, a larger group of resolutions could go on the consent agenda versus automatic required public hearings. There's also the exception that Dean notes here. Assembly may set resolutions for public hearing with such notice as it determines. If that ever comes up, I would ask Dean, because that's a pretty involved concept and a lot of debate between the Dean. And that'll be an unusual situation anyway, where if it's going to be set for a public hearing, you don't just put it out 2 weeks. I would say that most resolutions that have any type of controversy, I think my feeling is that the Assembly is pretty good about pulling those and having a public hearing. It doesn't sit well with anybody if a resolution is snuck through without sort of public hearing, the ones that should merit that. The consent agenda says items on the consent agenda do not require a public hearing. I think that's a little bit oversimplified. The introductions, there's certain parts of the consent agenda that will go on to public hearing, but I don't think that's really important to distinguish at this point. Do you, Dean? I think it's some do actually go on. Okay, well, I'm going to go on to. Go ahead, Dean.
Yeah, there's a few. There are a couple of, I guess, instances where you see a resolution set for a public hearing, but it wasn't on the consent agenda first. One of these is established by code. It's again liquor license protests, and as you all have experienced, if we introduce at one meeting in 9F and then wait for the next meeting for the public hearing, that adds a bit of time. And as you know, with liquor license protests, the state gives us 60 days from when they send the application for liquor license or the renewal or transfer of one. We got 60 days to do the protest, and that's very limited when we need to send that to community councils and to the departments to certify that the liquor license premises are in compliance with the applicable code provisions for fire or health if they serve food and so forth. So all of that within 60 days really cuts into our time. So I think a year or maybe two ago, we amended our code to say that the liquor license resolutions don't need to go in 9F, just go straight to a public hearing item in section 14. So you won't see those introduced. Now, the reason we can do that for resolutions is because of the exception I noted under the public hearing heading here. The code and the charter requires for ordinances the introduction and then at a meeting and then at least 7 days. But it doesn't say that for resolutions. And in our code, we have resolutions that may be set at public hearing with such notice as the assembly determines. So we passed this code section that says public hearings will be set this way for liquor license resolutions. So that's just, I guess, one exception to what we're talking here about the introduction in 7 days and so forth.
Anyway, that's a complicated area that you're going to seek Dean's assistance in if you're going to do that. So process, next slide, deadlines. And I don't know if Dean could have made this any more difficult, Dean, that your regular agenda is 2 Fridays at noon is the deadline for sending final documents to the clerk, meeting date minus 11 days. Okay, those of us on the administration side who are not quite so intelligent simply say the regular pace deadline is generally the Friday after your hearing, after your assembly meeting. So if your assembly meeting was last Tuesday, the deadline is Friday. So we do it in a little bit more simple fashion. Addendum is the
yes.
Friday prior to the assembly meeting. Go ahead, Dean. You can defend yourself. I have said, holy moly, how does he do this?
Sure, let me defend myself here. So we did have a different slide for the admin training, like Dee mentioned. And if you all have noticed, we've recently had 4 straight meetings and 4 straight Tuesdays. And so what that scribe doesn't work when we have meetings and successive Tuesdays rather than every other Tuesday. And the way I count it is this way, as I've described in this slide. But basically, a lot of assembly members who want action and the items ready and you want to say, let's send it in, but you need to look at the deadlines here. So if we can't make it for the 5th because of these deadlines, and looking at the May calendar, look at the 19th. And here on the calendar, I just want to point out for the 19th, going backwards is when you calculate your deadlines for the addendums, the 15th, the Friday before. For the regular agenda, which is really preferred, it's 2 Fridays before. So that's why I included this picture of the calendar, and my life really revolves around this calendar and the deadlines. And the significance here is I'm often trying to get my clients, you guys, your approval for what we've drafted. You know, we've made changes and so forth, and it's finally ready to go before I send it in. Because once it's sent in, it becomes a public document. It becomes open to the public. It's distributed in the public arena, and you can't make changes to it then except by a substitute version and so forth. I also want to say that these deadlines, they are the respectful deadlines for the agenda team in the clerk's office, and we should adhere to them as much as possible. And I am often asking for a little leniency, you know, can I have until 1 p.m.? We try not to do that often, especially when there's holidays coming up. So don't push those deadlines if you don't need to, is what I'm trying to say. And then again, there's this late on the table deadline at 1 p.m. the day of the meeting. And this is so the clerk's office, again, their staff can prepare them and distribute them and so forth. For me as Assembly Council, I, of course, am of the view that if we can do it, I will do it for you. And I can get the docs ready and distribute after these deadlines. But I would not want to send them to the clerk's office to process after that. And I will try to get them done if I can, but I can't promise I can if there's too much going on at the time. So my deadline is, if there's time, I'll do it.
Thanks. Ms. Quinn Davidson?
Yeah, thanks, Mr. Chair. I just wanted to emphasize, probably for Jamie more than anyone else, that when we do these deadlines, like, I don't treat noon as a deadline because I need to get it to Dean, who then needs to finalize it, who then needs to send it to the agenda team, and then gets on the agenda. So usually it's like Friday morning, you're kind of scrambling to get all that done. And then I wanted you to just simply explain, like, I think we're using these terms, but like, what is the addendum? Like, the addendum is just other agenda items that didn't make the initial deadline. So it's just the last chance other than late on the table to get it on there. But if anybody else wants to better explain it in a simple way.
So sure, I'll give that a shot. So the regular agenda, as you see, we published that, and the regular agenda, it gives the public a lot more advance notice before a meeting to see what the assembly is going to be considering, and if they wanted to contact you, their elected representatives, to talk about something, that gives them that time. And the addendum, it's the Friday right before a meeting, and it's usually goes out Friday before the end of the day for the public to see. So the addendum, as you said, Austin, is to add some additional items, sometimes because they need to get done, the timing is for it, or because of its relevance to the current events going on. You don't want to wait for a future agenda. So the addendum is helpful, but it's items being added. So it's preferred that everything go on a regular agenda for the public notice that provides. The addendum's a little less notice to the public in terms of time. And they're laid on the table, as you've seen. And we have some public process watchdogs that say we shouldn't do that at all. But sometimes they're just necessary. So they're laid on the table simply means, yes, you're adding it to the agenda. As you've seen, we vote to accept it for the agenda when the addendum comes in and when the laid on the table items are presented. Is that the explanation you were hoping for, Austin?
Yeah, I thought that was helpful. And then about late on the table, I didn't even know about a 1 p.m. deadline. And I expect that that indicates how much people were just laying things on the table because you'd arrive and you'd have new things. So that 1 p.m. deadline, I assume, is for the list of what's laid on the table that we get. And then as things are added after that, now we have a new process to try to limit those. But anyway, if there's anything more you want to say about that, I just didn't even know there was such a deadline.
Yes, like you said, if we have it listed in a laid on the table list in our folders, that would be because the clerk has processed it. You want to get it to the clerk's office by 1 p.m. You know, it might actually be 2 p.m., but I wanted to just do this a little earlier for the clerk's staff. But again, if we don't make that deadline, that doesn't mean you can't lay something on the table. It means that I will do it for you, or you will do it directly, working with me or the clerk, Barbara or Jennifer, and not sending it to the agenda team to process in the normal procedures they have to put it on the list and so forth. And also, the charter gives each assembly member the right to introduce an ordinance at a regular or special meeting. And that's a right that you can't be denied. It's guaranteed by charter. And so you could, you know, at 11:59 p.m. at a regular meeting just before adjournment, I laid this on the table. I want to introduce this ordinance, and you have that right to do that. The issue is, though, is the document ready for that? So we, of course, want to have a final document that is ready for public consumption, is what I like to call it, before you actually lay it on the table. But for the timing, if we can get that done and lay it on the table at a meeting, you can still do that. And the 1 p.m. deadline is for, if you want that more, I guess, established and formal process of having the clerk prepare it, you know, with the document number and putting it on the agenda addendum list, converting to PDF, distributing to everybody in a timely manner. That's that way.
Thanks, Dean. And just, I think the members got this in an email already, but just to reiterate, the new rules on the agenda that we passed this last Tuesday are going to be implemented for the first time on the May 19th meeting. So the May 5th meeting is going to operate under the old rules. And just had a follow-up question to what Ms. Quinn Davidson stated. So does the 1 p.m. Deadline for later on the table items, does that have any relation or not to the Assembly new requirement that's going to start on the 19th to have the acceptance by 2/3 vote for late on the table items? Is there any relation to that 1 p.m. deadline or not?
No, there not exactly. 1 p.m. is to get it presented to the Assembly that night at the meeting, but still at the meeting for the late on the table items, the Assembly votes on the item to accept it to the agenda. So it's just the 1 p.m. is to get it right form, copied, printed, distributed, and then at the meeting, the Assembly still needs to vote. And under the ordinance 2020-30 as amended that we just passed, again, like Felix mentioned, at the meeting, the Assembly will vote on the late on the table items, and now we need to have a vote of 8 members to accept them. Previously, it was just a majority, so 8 members to accept them to the agenda, and you should consider the criteria that we have in that new code section that read immediate Assembly actions necessary because of financial necessity, natural disaster, or times of essence for the Assembly action, and then consider that when you vote to accept the late on the table item to the agenda, starting with our May 19th meeting. And then that just makes it possible for the Assembly then to act on the item and still have that vote, motion to approve and vote on it and so forth. If it didn't get approved to add to the agenda, then that Assembly document would be considered at a future meeting if it's submitted for a future agenda.
Thanks, Dean. I don't see any further folks in the queue, so please continue.
And I did want to reemphasize what Dean said about deadlines. I think Dean and I are working late Thursday nights every other week, every Thursday night, because of people getting these things. With the administration, I try to get people to get them into PACE by Wednesday because everybody's busy with the Assembly on Monday and Tuesday and amendments and answering questions. It has to go through about 4 departments. I just wanted to stress, the word stress is that Thursdays and Friday mornings can be extremely stressful for Dean and I and anybody else in the Department of Law. So the quicker you can get these in, and I know that's a relative thing, but very high pressure on those days. Okay, the next one, drafting. There's a picture of muni.org, and over on the right side of that, there is an Assembly document prep guide, and it's about 30 pages long. I think, Dean, isn't that it's more geared toward PACE? I'm not sure. Maybe it's just legislative, but it has everything you could ever want to know, like whether it's a subsection or a section, spacing, underlining. I think for the most part, you're going to want, you're going to use your counsel for some of this. I find the templates are a little bit helpful because it already has the correct formatting.
If I may.
Yes.
Excuse me. Yeah, I want to make sure you understand this isn't at mooney.org that's available to the public. This is Mooniverse, and so I think you need to be logged into our municipal network to access Mooniverse. And I think that most assembly members might not have that access if they're on a municipal computer, and I think your iPad's issued from the municipality, but you wouldn't have access to Mooniverse, their personal computers or so forth. Well, you would have limited access. I don't think you have access to this page, but we should check that. But I just want to make it sure that this is not a publicly available page.
Okay. And we should figure that out. I don't know if members there have used, if they know whether they have access to that at this point. But offline, we should figure that out. But anyway, it's helpful.
You can if you can log into the municipal network.
Anyway, it's helpful, I think, to use the templates. I mean, they just have the formatting and lines and stuff, so a little bit helpful, saves Dean and I a little bit of time. So then the next one, let's see, just Dean was here pointing out just that oftentimes we do use template documents and we just change the things that need to be changed. Administration, we're really trying to do this, and marijuana is a great example that all those documents are template. It helps also when we review them because we know what information gets inserted, so we just need to look at that. We don't have to review every single code site in the entire document. So templates are very helpful. In the drafting guide itself, it talks about what is legislative formatting. So for instance, if you have an original ordinance and then you want to make an amendment to it, the new words and phrases are underlined, and the old ones on the far right of that are capitalized and put into brackets. So once you've done this for a while, and of course you're going to have counsel do a lot of this for you, it will just become second nature. But it's helpful because when the amended document comes up, or S1, you can track the changes from one document to another. I now, or my department, say, I would just assume you not do this at all, just redline a regular document so I can do it correctly, because it takes more time to do it correctly and have to check every single word. That's my preference. I just assume have you use a more straightforward approach like redlining. Dean, I don't know if you have what is helpful for the members to submit things to you.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, and then
well, I agree with Dee's approach. Generally, a member could try and do this, but anytime if it's sent to me, I want to change code this way, I am going to pull up the code section and make sure that it's formatted correctly, specifically. So it is helpful if you start by copying the code section you want to change and then redline with tracked changes. I will put into the proper format. But if you want to tackle it this way, you can. It's just a little bit more difficult to, like Dee mentioned, for us to then look at it and see what you're doing. It's easier for us to see what you want to do when you track changes, and then put it into this proper formatting. I also want to mention one thing here. So this legislative formatting is it's in our code and specific for code amendment changes. But we do use this, as you'll see in the next slide, I think, for resolutions when we're changing from an original resolution to a substitute, just for the transparency and clarity. Actually, I'm getting ahead of ourselves, aren't I? I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Go ahead. Oh, go ahead.
Are you ready for the next slide?
Sure.
Before we go on to the next slide, just want to put into the record, so Ms. Kennedy stated in our chat that you are correct, Dean, on the Muniverse, that we don't have access unless we log onto a Muni computer. Thanks.
I'm not certain if we have that access through the iPads that that IT provided to all of you.
I don't think so.
Okay, we can address that offline, but I think that's very important for you. There's lots of helpful information on that webpage.
Can I say something quickly, Mr. Chair?
So
Sure, go ahead.
I think for me, that's one of the main reasons that having an office would be helpful, besides talking with folks, with constituents, which, as you guys know, in the old days, we were always doing at coffee shops or wherever we could find. But I have a Mac at home, so I can't even access like my paycheck or anything, because you have to do it on a PC, and you have to do it, I think, on a muni computer if you want to do. So I've literally gone into the clerk's office and borrowed someone's computer to print something off that was like my personal SAP thing. So it's just, sometimes it's a pain for us. And anyway, I'm looking forward to having a place that we can actually do normal office stuff.
And can I tell you that,
want to,
Dean, I was just going to say, in
Sorry.
response to Austin, is they do have now a new computer program called CAMP. And from CAMP, you can get from non-MOA computers onto the different drives. Don't ask me which ones, but so I think that technology is now available. It was just released to the administration side in response to the telecommuting. And so it's there, and we just need to get a meeting with Susie and IT and to get you all on.
Got it. Thanks, Dee. I don't think that solves the Mac problem, but maybe that's just my own problem. SAP doesn't work on Macs.
Thanks. And I have a Miss Kennedy in the queue.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Yeah, I just want to ditto what Austin said, just in regard to how difficult it is when you have a Mac platform versus the PC. But I've also, my understanding is also that it's more of a security issue as well in terms of IT department's decisions. But if there is something that just came out and they're looking into it, then I would certainly be interested in finding out if that's something that really does go across all platforms. So thank you.
Yes, I would add that the cybersecurity is it's so important. We don't want to have a mass network failure because we opened up access. You know, we saw that happen in the Matsu in the city of Valdez. So that'd be another disaster of its own, a cybersecurity disaster. Anyway, so for Mooniverse and what we're talking about here, the assembly document prep guide, it's almost 50-page document. If you want it, I can email it to you. We could make it in PDF available to assembly members. And again, we were mentioning the templates that are useful, and I have those as well. If you want to start drafting something on your own, just ask me for templates. I'll send it to you by email. As for the other access to SAP and pay stubs and so forth, yeah, I think you need to talk to the clerk's office or the IT department.
And again, they do have the new program out, so the whole problem may be solved, but I'll find out for you.
Yeah.
So can we go on to legislative formatting? I think we've covered that, slide 14.
Yeah.
It's just what, Dean, can you turn it to slide 14? Okay. Yeah, there's just emphasis that following legislative format really just helps with clarity and transparency. So I'm going to go on to the next slide, 15. And this is just an example of, you know, your amendments have certain legislative formatting requirements, and then when you take an S version and do amendments, it has a whole different requirements. And I think only attorneys would bother to try to figure this all out. So I think most of the time you'll probably be seeking Dean's assistance. And I'm going to the slide 16.
Yeah. Can I mention something here? So in the column on the right, you see the different format used for deletions. And I just wanted to note that you sometimes see both of those used in one S version for code amendments. And this is the reason why. If it was new language that the original AO was adding, it's not capitalized. But if it was current code language, before the ordinance was introduced, it's capitalized. And a second point I wanted to make here is for the floor amendments. When I draft the floor amendments, I try to use these formatting conventions, and that's why you see some floor amendments using the S version formatting. But if we have an S version before the body and we're making floor amendments to it, I want you to be able to see what the amendment is doing as opposed to what's in the S version already. So I use S1 version formatting for the floor amendment when you're amending in the S version. And so that's why you might see the difference in the formatting for floor amendments. And hopefully it's understandable then. That finally, one other thing to add here is that doesn't end here. From time to time, some legislation, it's so controversial, there's so much debate that we see an S2 or an S3. I'm not sure if I've ever seen an S4 version. I think at that point, the body decides to start clean, something new instead of this. So the S2 and S3, we don't have a formatting convention laid out here. And what we do, as we mentioned at the beginning, these are guidelines. We just make sure that the intent is clear, maybe with a note in the document saying the changes are indicated by this, or we've omitted this. Just make it clear what the intent is and what we're showing in the document. So when you get to an S2, S3, maybe pay close attention to the notes or what's going on. And maybe at some point the body says, we should postpone this indefinitely and bring a new clean AO that just shows up clean language. And then again, sometimes I will do an S2 that says, we're not showing any legislative formatting. We're just presenting this all new and clean to replace the previous substitute. And the intent is clearer than when you say that. So again, we need that kind of flexibility in order to get these things done the way that the body wants it done.
Yeah, and I personally, I like that starting over approach after a couple rounds of drafting and legislative formatting. Okay, slide 16, drafting. Title must be an informative summary of the ordinance and resolution, all caps. It's important to figure out what you want in your title. It's the one part that used to be the only part that was searchable for the public. And so I thought because of that, and I'm not sure what those capabilities are these days, but I thought because of that, it really should have identify if you're doing a code change, the actual code section that is being changed, and to give the public fair notice, but again, for later searching. So sometimes you'll see in a title that says, of the Anchorage Assembly modifying, it'll have 20 code sections listed. And to you looking at it, you go, what in the world? Why is this helpful? Well, it's really for subsequent searching capabilities. So I think that's important. I think also making sure you have some keywords in there so people can search by keywords if they want. The public has different searching capabilities than we do, than the internal administration and the assembly. The other thing I think important about the title is in the old days, 10 years ago, if we had to change one word, then the feeling was then the whole ordinance had to be scrapped and you had to start again because it wasn't good public notice. There's been some cases, at least one case in the interim that said, Alaska Supreme Court case that said, no, if the public should have been on notice of what this was about and you make one type of change, then that's fine, as long as it gives the public decent notice that this could well happen. So, for instance, if there's an incorrect land description, but the other parts, the parcel identification or the name of the parcel, if those are correct, then you don't need to start over again. And so you'll see that debate at the hearing, like, well, geez, we're changing this word, and the attorneys sort of shuffle around saying, do we need a different ordinance? Is this good public notice? We've taken sort of a hard stance with respect to bonds, that even if you're debating a bond for $50 million, and if it goes up to $51 million, personally, I think that would fall within that rule. That's good enough notice, but I think both the Assembly and administration have said, no, Whenever we're going to amend a bond up, I think we start new, or we just can't do it. Dean, Dean and I have debated this for many years, and I think we're both on the side of it has to be a reasonable approach, not a technical approach. If you change one word that you need a new ordinance. Anything to add to that, Dean?
Yeah, I agree. And the whole purpose is that the public reading the title would be able to figure, well, yeah, I'm interested in this subject and what this is about. And then that's sort of the basis that you use. And then I would point out that this word in the first bullet, the informative summary, that's directly from the charter. And it's the charter that says the public notice for the public hearing for an ordinance must be an informative summary of what the ordinance is about. And so because we use the title of the ordinance in our agenda and for public notice on our public notices page, that's why the title has to be the informative summary. You would just complicate things if you publish a notice about the public hearing. That's different from the title of the ordinance. And then I would just add that this makes it important when you're considering amending code, for example, how narrow you want to write the title, how broad you want it to be. Because if you write it narrowly, for example, we're amending section 23060 regarding public hearings on resolutions. But then somebody wants to amend this ordinance to talk about the resolutions used for appropriations. Well, that's not really related to what the title said. We're amending 23060 appropriations, maybe amending 23040. You've written a title that's too narrow to have the flexibility for amendments that are sort of related to what the ordinance is doing, but they're not really described within the title. That's where we need to maybe, like Dee said, do it again and push it out to an S version public notice again. But if you write a broad title, for example, amending Title 2 regarding resolutions, well, then it allows, I think, sufficient notice for broader topics related to resolutions to be amended into that ordinance. So sometimes it's good to write broadly, sometimes it's bad. That's all relative, really.
Yeah, and we spend a lot of time on titles, actually, Dean and I, and but again, most of the time we'll be doing that. Okay, whereas clauses. Dean spoke to those earlier.
There's a lot of 2020 hindsight moments where we realize, oh, wish I wrote this narrower, or wish I wrote it broader.
Well, and the expanded is often when you're amending one code section, but then that same concept is found in two other titles that you didn't mention in your titles of the code that you didn't mention in your title to the ordinance, so that you find that later on. Whereas clauses, you do not need to have them in ordinances or resolution, and in the council before Dean thought that the whereas ordinances were really well suited for history. So she would try to be, if there was, other ordinances that preceded the one you're working on, would list all of those. And again, for searching capabilities for the public. I think we've gotten away from that a little bit, but you'll still see some of that. And that's why that's in there, the historical steps to how you got to where you're at. These would be ordinances from 10 years ago. Dean has always been very strong on make sure they're not controversial. So when we went around and around during the marijuana days about whether marijuana would be legalized, whereas clauses that would say, whereas marijuana is detrimental to the public in general, you can't, no, that's a controversial statement. It's not factual. And in fact, Dean is always calling me out on those type of things. That I think are harmless recitations of fact. He said, no, these are supposed to be factual. And I suppose, Dean, you could put something in that can you put in something that the assembly feels that this is detrimental to the public, or maybe that serves no purpose.
I'm sorry, what was that last question? Oh, if it serves no purpose.
Yeah, what are the purpose of the whereas clauses in general?
It does provide some legislative intent and sometimes legislative history. People have different views of the benefit of a whereas clause. In my years working for the municipality, I've seen some municipal attorneys that like to use them a lot, and they can be very elegant, and some that say, we don't want to use any, just put it all in the AM. So there's different viewpoints, but I think the main thing is you are voting on them as a majority to pass the ordinance, including these whereas clauses, so it becomes more the intent of the body as opposed to an aim, which is just the intent of a sponsor. And that's much less persuasive if you end up in court arguing about what does this code section mean, and the attorneys go into the legislative history. The whereas clauses, I think they have a little more substance to them than the AM does. But again, if they're like opinions and so forth, that just waters down their impact, and sometimes it makes them become the subject for amendments. And of course, my preference is fewer amendments the better. So if you make a controversial whereas clauses and submit it, and at the meeting you find people amending because they disagree about this statement or that, that's not very productive for the Assembly's time.
One of the things that we do put in whereas clauses, so are the standards. So let's say there's to convey a piece of property at less than fair market value, we'll have a code section on that says that the Assembly must find it's in the best interest of the city. Well, then that will be in our whereas clauses, and Dean and I will make sure that that's there, that if there are code imposed standards, that the whereas clauses say, and we've met these 5 standards. So you will see that. Going on to the drafting clause or page, ordain.
In addition, we often use whereases for some of the past actions that occur related to this topic. That at least gives you a roadmap. The Assembly passed some ordinance last year or 2 years ago that did this, and now we're doing this, and now the circumstances come up, and therefore we're making some amendments. So very straightforward and gives a roadmap, but I guess of maybe some prior history or prior code requirements.
And I think going back a couple years is one thing, and that is helpful. But I've seen them where they would go back 10 years and have 20 ordinances listed, and I'm not sure that's that helpful anymore. I think they can be a lot briefer and still be very helpful.
Yeah.
And then back to the drafting clauses, ordinances you ordain and resolutions you resolve. Effective date, it's generally immediately upon passage and approval of the Assembly. If there is retroactive application, that must be in the title. And the effective dates, a lot of times you have sort of a pause that it won't be effective for 3 months, or it's conditional. And, put in what you want to see, and then Dean and I help you make sure that it says what you think it says. Those are somewhat tricky. Dean, do you have anything to add to that one?
If I may add quickly, so most of the time the effective date is upon passage and approval. We need to be sensitive, though, that sometimes code change or a resolution requires some changes to be implemented, and documents or forms to be produced, and you want to give time for that. And one boilerplate effective date clause that we use is 30 days after, and we really want to use that if you're creating a new fine, adding some fines to Title 14 or civil fines table. or administrative fines table because they need to update some forms and maybe some citation forms and so forth. And there's a uniform offense citation table that the Department of Public Safety puts together and includes our fines. And they need time to add those to their database. So we always have a 30 days delayed effective date for a lot of those when we're adding some fines to Title 14. And then there's some others where they're affecting, for example, the development and construction industry. We just had this come up at our recent community economic development meeting, a committee meeting. You don't want to make a change that is going to affect the construction season and make that change in June in the middle of it. You want to make that maybe delay the effective date until after construction season is over to apply to the next year. Otherwise, you have, well, I think you get what I'm saying.
Yeah, and Dean, I think that's an excellent point. And usually departments, or I mean, the department should be aware, I think, of some of the things you're thinking of, that you've already contacted the department, or so they would provide that information with you. And that again is why these last minute documents that both sides, Assembly and Administration, have not seen before they even go onto the agenda can be problematic, because you're not thinking of things like that. And again, Dean and I have a pretty free exchange of documents. We know which ones people want to keep confidential, but we try to check that out and get to and provide access to departments to Dean. But there are many considerations like that should be addressed. I'm going on the agenda. Okay, the next few slides just talk about where you can find help. One is the document preparation guide, and I'll find out. Again, I think you may have access. I think that problem may be solved. And then finally is just who in the legal world is doing that. Myself, Quincy Arms is our PACE person, and Jessica and Dean. But again, we work very cooperatively on these documents and deadlines. And that's all I have.
I had added the Assembly Department, myself, and the Municipal Clerk's Office. And you would want to talk to Barbara or Jennifer for the Municipal Clerk's Office working on things. They do most of the recognition resolutions all independently on their own. They do help with many other Assembly documents, though. Of course, I want to give them credit for what they do. They do a lot of work. For example, Barbara has worked extensively on the recent ordinances we passed Tuesday night for 2020-30S and the Title 28 election code changes and so forth. Anyway.
Yeah, I would add that too, is if I have a question on procedure, I'll call Barbara first and Jessica, that they generally have been through this before, and they know the policies on both sides of the issue. So I think Dean and I do seek out their counsel on a regular basis for questions that aren't quickly answered.
Mm-hmm.
Thanks, Dee, and thanks, Jean. I guess the only thing that I would add on this particular slide is for the Assembly Department Clerk's Office recognition resolutions. Daryl Hess works on a lot of recognition resolutions as well, but just like Dee assigns out work in legal, Barbara and Jennifer assign out the work on recognition resolution. So I would always go to Barbara and Jennifer first, and then they'll assign out to Daryl or to, I know Kiana has done several recognition resolutions in the clerk's office. So that's the procedure that folks should follow. With that, are there any questions? Okay, I'm not seeing any questions. Since we do have a short amount of time, I will see if there are any members of the public here who wish to speak. So I think we only have one member of the public, potentially. So 351-6066, if you are a member of the public and would like to speak, I think you're unmuted, so go ahead. Okay, not hearing that. Then I don't think we have any other members of the public. So thanks everyone, and thank you Dee and Dean for these presentations. Very helpful.
Yeah, thanks to you
Thank you,
both.
everyone. Thanks,
All right.
Steve.
Thanks. Have a good weekend, everyone. Bye.
Thank you.
Bye. Thanks.
Bye-bye.